Welcome to the Brett Davis Podcast.
Hello, everybody. This is Brett Davis coming to you from the IQ Podcast studio in Coronado. I hope everybody's having a nice, dry evening wherever you're at, or wet if you like the rain and it's therapeutic. I'm very honored to have Professor Greg Daddis. Nice to see you, Greg.
Thanks for having me on, Brett. Appreciate it.
Do I call you doctor?
Greg, please.
Okay. So you're a professor of history for the USS Midway. We have mutual friends there, of course, chair and then modern U.S. military history for San Diego State University.
Yeah.
How difficult is teaching history right now with all the changes and things that seem to be coming in left and right? How do you adapt to that? And then we're going to talk a little bit, actually a lot about the fact that Vietnam, it's been over 50 years.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? That this transformative moment in the 20th century is over 50 years ago now. It's crazy. I think we're closer to World War II when I was in college than we are to Vietnam now. So it's pretty nuts. So I got here to San Diego State in June of 2020. I like to say it was, I thought it was at the middle of the pandemic, but it ended up being the beginning of the pandemic. Was here because the USS Midway had chaired a position in US military history, which is pretty phenomenal. You don't really see a lot of chaired positions in military history across the country. Was incredibly fortunate and honored to be selected for the position. And so for me, I think what's been interesting in this moment in time where we really see history itself being politicized, that history has been deemed by many Americans, I would argue, is pretty dangerous. It's been a fascinating moment to kind of to teach about our nation's past in a way that's honest, but also isn't, problematic, I think, from a political standpoint. We always like to I like to tell my students that history should make you uncomfortable. And for me, who is somebody that teaches the Cold War era, it's interesting to see a lot of similarities between what we saw in the 1950s and these intense fears of communism and domestic threats and overseas threats combining together with kind of what we're seeing today.
How has history, we know the history from what we remember, what we were told about Vietnam on the news and in the newspapers, but have there been new things that have come out that maybe are controversial with what we thought?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest trend in the scholarship over the last probably decade or so is we're really starting to see more Vietnamese voices being incorporated into the story. I think back in the 1970s and 80s, as Americans were coming to grips with this incredibly divisive and traumatic event in their history, this is really the first time that the United States is kind of confronted with the limits of its power. And this is, the moment in time when Bill Murray is joking on stripes that we're 10-1, and what happened to the one. And so I think what we saw during that late 70s, early 80s moment in time is you started seeing memoirs come out in the first cut of history. It was very American centric. We were looking at this experience and asking the question, what did Vietnam do to us? And I think as we're now starting to ask bigger questions about what did the war mean for those living in Southeast Asia, not just in Vietnam, but in Cambodia and Laos, you're starting to see a bit different story kind of evolve in terms of this not just being a war against between communists and anti-communists, but really being a war about Vietnamese identity and questions over nationalism in the kind of post-World War II, post-colonial moment. And I think that's been really important for us because, I probably not surprisingly, I think especially as we look at our military past, we look to how our wars have affected us, and don't ask enough questions about how our wars have affected other people.
So I'm sure you get a lot of questions from students. And what's your take on the Vietnam War? Was it necessary? Did we need to be there? I've heard mixed things. We shouldn't be there. Do you ever go over those subjects at all?
Yeah, absolutely. My personal take is that I think we probably overestimated the threat. I've been to Vietnam twice. I took a group of West Point cadets back in 2015, and then took another tour group there in 2020. And especially when I was teaching West Point cadets, there was just one moment in time we went out to. We were kind of traveling from north to south, and we were going through the countryside. And I just asked them to kind of take a look at this clearly agrarian, still agrarian based economy, and just say, ask the central question: how did these people pose a existential national security threat to the United States? And I think we overestimated that back in the 1960s, that we kind of believed that this was some part of a larger communist conspiracy directed by Moscow that just wasn't the truth. And in the process, I think caused a lot of destruction, caused a lot of death, and I'm not so sure it was all that worth it. I can't really see that if Ho Chi Minh had won earlier, and the country had been unified as a communist state back in the late 50s or early 60s, that it really would have made that much of a difference from the global perspective, from a grand strategic perspective during the Cold War. So, and this is always a hard question to ask, right? Or how do we know if and when wars are worth fighting? And clearly we're grappling with that today.
That was probably the first time in American history that there seemed to be what the word would be, a disagreement. And a lot of times, from what I understand, hearing different stories and talking to people that were there, when they did come back to the United States, they were spat on. Not saying everybody did that, but there was almost this disrespect. They were called baby killers. They were called all these varieties of things. And a lot of them were patriotic and doing, what anybody in any other war had done in the past. Why do you think there was such division with this war compared to the wars of the past, like Korea and World War II?
Yeah. I think probably because the threat was taken differently. I think, if you look back, especially in World War II, the threat was more identifiable, especially for Americans in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor attack in December 41. And my strong sense is that by the time you get to the mid and latter portion of the 1960s, Americans are starting to question whether this threat really is important enough for Americans to continue to be dying. I think sometimes we forget that there, in fact, was quite a bit of support in the early 1960s. When President Johnson has the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that he proposes to Congress, and Congress signs on to that, there's quite a bit of support for American intervention in Vietnam. It's not really until over time that we start to question whether the war was worth it or not. And I think what you see happen in the 1960s is really, especially for those who are dissenting against the war, kind of a conflation between the war itself and the veterans who were fighting it, the soldiers that are fighting it. And I think there's kind of been a huge pendulum swing in the other way in our more recent wars, especially after 9/11, where sometimes I wonder if we're not critical enough of our foreign policy and national security strategy because we're afraid of offending the veterans. And so this kind of thank you for your service mentality, I would argue, is potentially a little bit dangerous because we're so afraid of debating national security issues, debating the defense budget, for fear of being branded as unpatriotic, for fear of being branded as not supporting the veteran, that we miss out on these really important conversations we should be having about our policy when it comes to defense.
So we have all these this information that's come out about Vietnam. How do you keep your students engaged? Because we are in a different time. It's not the Cold War. It's not Vietnam. It's not World War II or Korea. And somewhere along the line, and I know this is probably something you don't get into, maybe you do. To me, we seem like we're not that going to war and people being killed is patriotic. I mean, some people consider it patriotic for our freedoms. But how do you discuss with the younger generation that you talk to, or anybody maybe that isn't aware of what we're talking about as far as those past times that we were around? You look relatively young, by the way, so I don't know if you remember Vietnam. I remember when it ended.
Right.
But
Um,
so
yeah,
how do
it's a
they?
good
How do
question, right?
because they're not? They're, it
Yeah.
seems to me like there's less patriotism. Am I right? There seems to be a lot of
Today,
hostility. Yes.
uh, I don't know. I don't really get a sense of that from my students. I mean, I taught at West Point for the last
Okay.
5 years. I was in the military, and I after that I spent 5 years teaching at a private institution in Orange County, Chapman University, before coming here to SDSU. To be honest, I don't see a lot of difference between the students that I taught at West Point and the students that are here at SDSU. Um,
It's interesting
uh,
because San Diego State, I would think, would be have probably more anti-war type situations because it seems like, and again, you're teaching and you're around it, but you're saying no, huh?
Yeah, not really. I think in part because we do have a lot of students who are here from the Southern California area, so they're familiar, obviously, with the large naval presence here. I've so many students whose parents served in the Navy or other branches of the armed forces. So I think that might have a bit to do with it. Um, my sense is that it may not be a lack of patriotism as opposed to just a lack of desire to be outwardly patriotic, right? My strong sense is that students are still asking really important questions. They're still engaged. I don't see a lot of flag waving, but I didn't really see it at West Point either. Right? It was just kind of this
Really?
quiet approach to for for West Point cadets. What I would tell folks all the time is kind of quiet professionalism, right? That they knew why they were signing up to go to West Point. They knew that they were going to be signing up to go into the Army in West Point's case, and just didn't make a big deal about it. Right? They were focused on their classes. They were focused on sports. They're focused on their free time going out when they could. And I really don't see a lot of difference with my students here. They're more focused on their studies, and a lot of my students are working and balancing, work with school. Um, and yeah, so I have not seen a lot of um, but I'm also teaching kind of military history courses, war and society courses that I may have students that are just self-selecting into those courses because that's what they're interested in too.
Well, it is fascinating. Now, let's do a comparison, and I'm sure there's a lot of differences, but is there a similarity to the way Russia is at war right now to our Vietnam? Because it seems like a lot of their people, from what I'm understanding, don't want to be in that war.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there a similarity in any way?
We need to be careful. I always tell my students, historical parallels are always kind of fraught. But I do think there are a few fundamental ones. I think perhaps the most important similarity is the assumptions that leaders make about going to war, right? That when we went to Vietnam, we were making assumptions about what we could achieve there. We
Mhm.
assumed that by applying military force, it could be socially transformative, that we could transform this burgeoning democracy into a strong state that was anti-communist, democratic, open to free markets, all of that, that would be supported introduction of military force. I think Putin has done the same in Ukraine. He has assumed that by applying military force, he was going to achieve his objectives rapidly, and clearly that has not been the case. I think he's assumed that the Russian people were going to support this outwardly, um, and clearly that has not been the case. And and so
He
I
seems
think this series is a yeah. Go ahead.
he seems surprised that this
Oh
thing
yeah,
has gone on
absolutely.
as long as it has.
Yeah, and
And
I think too. My understanding is that, and perhaps this is where we can make a parallel with other kind of totalitarian-like societies, where you have this bubble around decision makers that's not helpful for you, right? That you need good, honest reporting
sure.
from the military front for politicians, political leaders to make sound decisions. And my strong sense is he's probably not getting that, or at least wasn't early on. And I think this is a really important point for us as Americans to think about what we expect of war. What do we assume war will give us? And I think for much of our history, we have had a faith in what war will deliver for us. And I think that's probably part of our own history. I mean, war has been a part of us since the very beginning. It offered us our independence. It ostensibly solved the problem of slavery, although we're still clearly dealing with the ripple effects of civil rights to this day.
Mhm.
We assumed in the Cold War era that we were going to use military force to easily contain communism, and it became a clearly decades-long costly endeavor. And I think more recently we've seen in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, this kind of faith-based approach to war that we need to reconsider. And I think Putin's very messy and long and unexpected offensive in Ukraine is just another example of the faith that policymakers place in war that we need to really question.
So when anybody's coming into your class, and I have this article
Mhm.
that we did on you a while back in November, why Vietnam still matters. Do you remember that article?
Yeah. Mhm.
What do you want people in tonight's podcast to take away from your thoughts on Vietnam or that article?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is an uncomfortable answer, I think, and hopefully I'm not going to get branded as unpatriotic here. But I think what we need to take out of Vietnam is the idea that this was really the first moment in the history of our nation where we were uncontestably facing the limits of American power. This
Mhm.
was the first time where we employed military force and didn't get what we wanted. And you can make a similar case, I think, for Korea, but the war in Korea from 50 to 53 still rolled back the communist offensive. It reestablished the status quo. Whereas that wasn't the case in Vietnam. In 1975, the political state that we were supporting quite literally no longer existed.
Do you
Um,
think it also
and so,
helps the president, just I'll ask real quick, 50 to 53, you said it was Korea. Do you think
mhm.
it makes a difference when you had somebody like an Eisenhower that had been in wars? He understood certain things maybe that the average president maybe didn't understand, that, there's just things you learn on the battlefield. I mean, would have made a difference had we had Eisenhower, I wonder? Uh,
Earlier.
or no, well, Eisenhower during Vietnam. Imagine if we had Eisenhower
Oh
as
yeah,
president instead of, what was his
yeah.
name? I'm
That's a
forgetting.
great question. The big
What's his name again?
counterfactual, right? Is I said
LBJ,
that's a
LBJ,
really
LBJ. That might have made a
yeah.
difference, right?
It's hard to say. I mean, the biggest question is always what would have happened if Kennedy had lived, right? If he wasn't assassinated,
Well, that he didn't want,
would we have gone to Vietnam?
and he didn't really want to go to Vietnam, I understand, originally.
Yeah, that's a big debate in the historical community. I mean, you see this huge uptick in the number of advisors that during Kennedy's presidency. So it's hard to say. I think what you saw in Vietnam, and I think probably what you saw in both in Iraq and Afghanistan for us, is that policymakers are relying on the evaluations and assessments of their senior military commanders, and that was what was happening in Vietnam. So in June of 65, as the Johnson administration is making a decision to escalate in Vietnam, um, they're getting reports from the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, um, pretty damning critique saying that if we don't act now, Vietnam will fall. And that's kind of a hard question to ask. How would Eisenhower have responded differently to those types of memorandum? Would Kennedy have responded differently? And I'm not so sure, in large part because all of those presidents, Truman, Kennedy, Eisenhower, Johnson, even Nixon, I think they were all committed to this larger idea of containing communism globally. And for them, they truly did believe that the dominoes might fall. And it was Eisenhower who, oh, by the way, came up with that phrase that the domino theory, that if we don't hold here, then the next domino will fall, and then the next domino will fall. So it would have been interesting to see somebody like Eisenhower dealing with these reports from the field, saying that if you don't act now, if the United States doesn't intervene in South Vietnam, your one ally in Southeast Asia will fall. Um, yeah, it's a great counterfactual, right?
Do you think the United States has learned from Vietnam? Do you think we'll ever make that same type of mistake in another potential situation where there could be war?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're good at making mistakes, right?
Wow.
What did Winston? What did Winston?
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
Yeah.
I
Um,
did. because I think
What
you're
did
right.
Winston Churchill say?
That's a great cigar. Give me another one.
Yeah, that's right. He's leave it to the Americans to come up with the best answer after they've gone through all the wrong ones, right, or something like that.
Is that what he said?
Something
like
like that.
that.
I don't, yeah, paraphrasing. Um, yeah, it's hard. We kind of Americans are pretty good at having kind of a historical amnesia, and
Wow.
um, you know, uh, it's hard for us to kind of learn lessons from history. I think because we do believe we're exceptional. We do believe that if we apply military force, we're going to achieve the objectives that we set out for ourselves. And um, we set out some pretty bold political objectives in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And as we're now coming up on the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, I think we're going to start seeing similar questions arise again. What did we learn from Iraq? What have we learned from Afghanistan? Will we be able to take those lessons into the future? Um, and I don't think we've seen the last of these types of problems, unfortunately.
What's your biggest takeaway for your students that you like them to get from your class as they go along and they learn about the war? Because I can see your passion. You're very knowledgeable. But what is it, because you have a passion for this, what is it you'd like to see them take away from your course?
Um, to be more informed citizens. That war is not without its consequences. There are times, absolutely, where military force is necessary. We do and always have lived in a dangerous world. Power matters. From a realist perspective, power matters. Um, Military force, whether you like it or not, is relevant in international society. But war comes with its consequences. And in a democracy, I think it's so incredibly important for us to be informed citizens about our national security strategy and our grand strategy when it comes to the use of military force. And I would argue that just not enough Americans um, are knowledgeable about um, national security issues in a way that we probably should be. So we can have debates, so we can make informed decisions, and help our representatives make informed decisions for us. Because I think the most important thing we do as Americans is send our sons and daughters overseas to fight on our behalf, and we should have a stake in that, regardless of whether we have a conscript army like we did in World War II or an all-volunteer force like we do today.
I look forward to meeting you in person one of these times.
Yeah,
I
well,
think
come on out to our class. We'd love to have you.
well, that would be great. Maybe I'll do that. And
Yeah,
tell you,
great.
it's important what you're doing, and I'm glad to hear the way you talk about the war. It almost transports you there. I feel like
Yeah,
you're
thank
taking
you.
me back in time when you talk about it, and that's to me is a sign of a good instructor, or teacher.
Well, if you hear some helicopters in the background, you'll know I did it right.
I hear helicopter. I'm in Coronado. I hear those helicopters all the time, man.
That's right. That's right.
So, is there any books coming out that you're thinking about putting out or writing?
I recently came out with a book from Cambridge University Press called Pulp Vietnam. It's on these men's adventure magazines that were popular in the 50s and 60s. I came across them when I was teaching at West Point, and went down this very long rabbit hole to look at how popular culture was informing these young American kids that were going out off to Vietnam, and having them think about their place in the military and what it meant to be a man in the 1950s and 60s. And so it was a really cool project, because before that I'd really studied strategy and the kind of strategic decisions that led to our involvement in Vietnam. So it was a kind of neat break to do some work on a cultural study and looking at these magazines, which were just really phenomenal cultural products. And what I'm working on now is this kind of larger book on America's relationship with war during the Cold War era.
Well, I look forward to getting some of your material. I do like war, studying it, not being in it, but
Right.
studying it
That's right.
because it is fascinating. What movie best depicts the Vietnam War that you've seen from what you've read?
Oh, boy.
Is there one or two that stand out in your mind?
I think from a tactical perspective, I think We Were Soldiers gets it pretty close. And what I do like about that movie, it also brings in the North Vietnamese perspective, which you don't get a lot. You know, those kind of classic movies, The Deer Hunter or Apocalypse Now.
Right.
It's kind of, all these trippy movies from back in the late 70s, early 80s.
Well, you know why they were like that, right?
Uh,
It was
what's that?
a lot of people were doing drugs during that time.
That's right. Yeah, just ask Dennis Hopper on the set of Now, right?
Exactly.
But from a tactical operational standpoint, I think We Were Soldiers gets it pretty close in terms of this back and forth struggle that was really the first major battle that the Americans fought in Vietnam. So I'd probably, off the top of my head, I would probably have to say that one.
Okay.
Although it's interesting to kind of pull students into some of these older movies, because it does kind of show this arc, right? The Taxi Driver and Deer Hunter were these movies that were showing the damaged veteran that was so popular back in the early to mid 70s. And then by the time you get to the 80s and the Rambo movies, we've kind of flipped that on its head, and these kind of almost war porn of these massive muscle guys that are heading back to Vietnam and winning this time, as Rambo says, right? So it's interesting to kind of watch that narrative arc happen in Hollywood as we're collectively as a nation dealing with the after effects of Vietnam, which is pretty interesting.
Well, thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Do you have a website at all or anything?
No, just my university website. Yeah, I'm on Twitter. That's about it.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you being on, Greg, and fascinating. Thanks for taking me back in time a little bit and remembering that period of time. I remember it well. Not as well as the people that were there, but I remember what was going on here. But thank you so much for being on tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You take care, Greg.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, everybody. That's Professor Greg Daddis, of course. And I want to thank my sponsors, because I wouldn't be able to have power to be able to do this amazing podcast. Sequan Casino and Resort, Attorney King, Labella's Pizza, one of the oldest Italian restaurants in San Diego, and Old Chula Vista on 3rd Avenue. Also, the Loan Queen, thank you for your support and everything you do. Great time to get a loan or a mortgage. I highly recommend the Loan Queen, Adriana Gibbons. Anti-aging doctor Melinda Silva, who's a great doctor who's looking at natural ways to slow down the aging process, and of course find ways to offset major illnesses if you can. She's good at doing that. Dr. Melinda Silva. And of course, Garage Bonificetta, the Italian restaurant in Coronado, and great food that he has. And so I don't know if you've been to Bonificetta, Greg, but it's really, really good. They've got 4 of them in San Diego. Great Italian food. Last but not least, Alan Kinzel, who's going to be doing his wonderful and amazing talent show in Coronado's Got Talent coming up with Larry Kinzel. That's going to be coming up very soon. You'll be hearing more about that, and we'll be talking about that as it gets closer. Everybody have a good night, and let's be nice to each other. Have a good night.